right, well, if you don't know me, my name's TJ. I'm one of the pastors here at City of God, and I'm thrilled to be able to share with you from God's Word again. It is an honor and a privilege to fill the pulpit while Eric is preaching this morning in Kentucky. If you have a Bible with you, we'll jump right into it. You can go ahead and open it up to Acts 18. As many of you probably know, we've been walking through the book of Acts for over a year now. Eric mentioned in passing last week that the exposition of Scripture is one of our core convictions here at City of God, and one of the ways that plays itself out is in our Sunday morning sermon series, where we take a book of the Bible, and those series are us walking through that text a chunk at a time, week after week, until we go from beginning to end. And when you have a book like Acts, it has a lot of narratives and a lot of stories, sometimes from week to week, the theme of the message or the text may change drastically, or it may stay the same. And I say all that to say this, I don't know if I have a new sermon this morning or just a continuation, a sequel, a part 2 to last week's message. So we'll continue to look at the book of Acts, and we're going to keep working through this question of how can I faithfully live on mission? So let's kind of, just real quick, maybe we don't do this enough, but let's recap where we are in the book of Acts. Maybe you haven't been here the whole year and a half we've been doing this. This is one of your first Sundays here. But we've picked up in Acts, which comes after the Gospels. So this is post-resurrection of Jesus, right? So Jesus, at the end of the Gospels, is crucified, he dies, is buried, resurrects, and then makes appearances for 40 days or so until we get to Acts chapter 1. In Acts chapter 1, we have this profound and powerful event where on the Mount of Olives, Jesus ascends to the Father in heaven to take a seat at the right hand of God. But before he leaves, he instructs his disciples with this, saying, hey, I'm leaving, but the Holy Spirit is coming to encourage and equip and empower you to do my work. Now, what is that work? He says in Acts 1:8, it's advancing the gospel, right? He said, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. A continuation of the work of Christ through his disciples. So then at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, it happens just as Christ said it would, right? The Spirit descends, the gospel is preached, thousands from all over the world are saved and baptized, and what we see is the upstart or the birth of the church, this new faith community that is committed to and defined by the gospel of Jesus. And week after week, we've tuned into our passage on Sunday morning to see how the gospel continues to grow and expand in spite of difficulties and opposition, that even when the church is oppressed or imprisoned or threatened, that the gospel, with this end of his second missionary expedition. So last week, we remember Eric took us through the end of Acts 17, and Paul was in Athens, a city known for its arts and its architecture and aesthetics, as well as its religious commitment to a whole plethora of gods, which worked itself out in the strong presence of many idols and temples in the city. So he has left there after being with them and visiting them with just a short time. Remember, Paul his pattern was kind of to go into the synagogue on Sundays, and even I think in the marketplace throughout the week, and he would reason with the Jews and the philosophers there in Athens. He stayed there a little time. His response to the gospel message that he preached there in Athens, it tells us at the end of kind of that story there that a lot of it was met with mockery, and some folks made light of his message. But Paul's time in Athens last week closed with this report that in spite of all that, some men and women believed and joined with him, and Paul left Athens again after probably just a couple of weeks, and he moves on to where we pick up the passage today in Corinth. Again, Corinth is another major city, a hub of influence, both politically and economically. It is an epicenter for trade and travel, having 2 harbors, and it was also a host Corinthian series a couple years ago. It was known specifically for its sexual immorality. It was so embedded in their culture, sexual immorality, in the slang of the time, that folks would call one another a Corinthian, and that meant they were fornicators, or if you were said to have a Corinthian companion, that was a prostitute. Many commentators have called Corinth a sin city of its day, which kind of begs the question, with that being the case, so much evil and vile in the city, why would Paul desire to go there? Paul knew that because people from all over the empire passed through Corinth, a strong church there could touch lives all over the empire. He knew that Corinth was a tough city, but he wasn't only interested in planting churches where it was going to be easy to do so. That yes, Paul wanted to go where Christ was needed the most, but I also think in his missionary mindset, he probably likely had the notion that he knows if we can plant a strong church here, if we can make disciples here, we can make disciples all over the earth from here. We say that because it's a shared opportunity that we have here at City of God, and we don't want to gloss over that. But let's pick up in Acts 18, the first 8 verses or so. Let's get back into our story here. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, and they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there and he went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Place in the synagogue, reasoning with the Jews and philosophers in an effort to show them Christ. And now Paul shows up in Corinth, and he resumes this normal pattern of reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath, just like every week, likely every day, trying to show Greeks and the Jews that Jesus alone is the way to salvation. But his presentation of the gospel is not as welcomed here in Corinth as it is in other places. Now, Paul is no stranger to hardship in ministry up to this point, right? We saw in Acts 14 that Paul was stoned and left for dead in Lystra. He's able to dust himself off and bind up those wounds, and the very next day he leaves to preach the gospel in the next city. We saw in Acts the gospel in Corinth that they oppose and revile him. That is, when Paul tries to witness to these people, and probably I follow the same pattern as he did in Athens, to open up the Old Testament scriptures and show them, specifically his Jewish audience, that the Old Testament prophecies and the Old Testament prophets all were pointing to Christ, and he's the fulfillment, he is the Messiah. That when he preaches that message and tries to draw them into repentance and faith, that they don't take to it. In fact, they come together and take a stand against him. And they begin to push back on his teaching. And when that doesn't stop Paul, they begin to hurl insults and accusations. They attempt to vilify Paul and blaspheme Christ. And we'll even go as far to push for his arrest. It's an aggressive and intense opposition, which you would have to imagine at this point Paul is growing weary of. So how does Paul respond? In this passage, he moves on. He tells them that their blood is on their own heads. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles, and he dusts off his feet and leaves, right? His assertion that their blood is on their own heads is a simple, but it's a powerful way of saying, fine, I've done my part, I'm innocent, you're standing in pending judgment before God, now that's on you. It also says that he shook out his garments. Paul did this so not a speck of dust from the synagogue would remain on his clothes, much less his sandals. This was a dramatic way of expressing his rejection of their rejection. And as we know, Paul's certainly capable of dramatic and vivid demonstrations of his message. Of all the examples we have, I think, in the book of Acts and in the New Testament as a whole, of people sharing the gospel and living on mission and working to advance the gospel, I think this interaction here is one of, if not the most relatable to you and I. I think this is the interaction here that we resonate in our current culture and context the most. Not because it is what happens the majority of the time we share the gospel, but because it's the scenario we most imagine will occur if we do. There's a missions agency back in 2020 that polled 1,600 evangelical Christians between the ages of 18 and 65 and asked them one question, said, what is the one reason you don't share your faith? Of those responses, 52% were associated with one thing: fear. Fear of offending, fear of hostility, fear of rejection, fear of sharing openly. And that's kind of the tension we live in, right? Constantly worrying about the level of risk that is involved, or the possibility that we might lose a relationship or suffer another great loss for sharing what we hold to be the good news of Jesus. That even for us, living in a context that long has been open and had the freedom to sharing the faith and worshiping without persecution or imprisonment, that it's still a pretty weighty matter to consider the oppression or the ostracism that might stem from our witness. We kind of briefly talked about this last week, but want to double down on it today, that life on mission can be hard. It can be lonely, and it can be discouraging. I know for me personally, some of the most difficult, discouraging, deflating seasons for me have been when I feel like my efforts in evangelism were not successful. When mission wasn't going well, when conversations with the lost didn't seem to take root, I got really, really deflated. Maybe the best example of this for me, no doubt the most vivid example for me, was when I was in college. This was an extremely challenging time for me. I probably shared from the stage before that college wasn't something I'd really planned on doing. I didn't have a master calendar plan, schedule, life map, or anything coming out of college. I don't even know if the school had a guidance counselor. But I didn't have I showed up in the middle of this, requiring it and making it mandatory for a grade. And I didn't know what service to pick, so I asked the only friend or two I had on campus, hey, what do you guys do for this Christian service credit? And they said, we do something called Monday night visitation. And I was like, that sounds awesome. I would love to do that, because in the small Baptist church I grew up in, as a young minister, I had taken part in hospital visitations. I'd done nursing home visits almost weekly. I was all about going to the sick and the shut-in in the church and checking in on them, except that's not what Monday visitation was here. Monday night visitation was when a bunch of people from campus and from the church would gather there at the church on campus, and we'd have a bit of a pep talk from a pastor, and then they would send us out in droves into the neighborhoods. And we would drive out all. I was just a naturally nervous person, very introverted, and no one ever went for that. But I didn't know how to do this. This wasn't something I was familiar with, this type of ministry. So I went out with somebody who'd done it before. The first time I went, I said, hey, how do I do this? What's the strategy here? What's the game plan? He said, we'll go to a neighborhood and we'll knock on a door. All right, I could probably do that. We'll tell them we're with the church, okay? We'll invite them to Sunday service. Perfect, I can do that. He's like, and then usually I ask them if they know what would happen if they died right now. I was almost there, buddy. And as you can imagine, for someone with crippling anxiety, unfamiliar with this ministry, I didn't see a lot of success. I'm very, very fortunate that this time of my life was predated like the video doorbells that are so popular now. Otherwise, there'd be countless videos of just 19-year-old baby-faced me just standing on someone's stoop, sweating and stuttering and stammering before I finally just yelled out, "Are you ready to die?" and threw a tract their way and took off running back to my car. This is going to shock you, but I didn't have a lot of success in these evangelistic efforts. I even got some backlash and met some folks that are pretty hostile to people knocking on doors, inviting them to church. And that was so discouraging for me. I can look back and laugh on it now, but at the time I'd go back to my dorm room and sulk and wonder, maybe I'm not cut out for ministry. Maybe I'm not cut out for mission. Maybe there's something wrong with what I believe or how I believe it and practice it and exercise it. And I would get so down, feeling rejected and inadequate. So then what's our hope during these hard situations, right? Because last week, Eric brought it to us, right? He told us straight up, every Christian is a missionary, and cast a vision for the people of City of God to be people who are faithfully on mission, to be a church where we are regularly baptizing our neighbors and our coworkers and our roommates and our children. We think sometimes that missionaries are only those we send out far away, but it's just not the case. That we saw last week in the Great Commission, the instructions to make disciples of all nations was given to all followers of Christ everywhere. Do you know the difference between a Christian that lives in Lafayette, Indiana, and a Christian that lives in Lak Sumawe, Indonesia? About 9,200 miles. But other than that, they have the same mission. Love God, love people, and advance the gospel where they are. But man, what's our hope when that's really hard to do? I read this passage and I think if Paul had hardships and opposition and struggles that left even him down and deflated in his efforts to live on mission for Christ, then what hope do we have to push through the same for the glory of God and the work of the gospel? The answer to that question is in verses 9 through 11. We'll keep reading. Acts 18:9, and the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you." And no one will attack you or harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. And he stayed there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So verses 8 through 11 tells us that when Paul storms out of the synagogue, he goes, almost like if I felt like you guys weren't listening, and I just got really mad and stormed and went into this office over here. Like, Paul does not go far. He was just being a little dramatic. He doesn't leave. He doesn't go far. He goes to a house right next door to the synagogue, and he begins to minister into the home of Titus Justice, a worshiper of God. And he's in that home, and he's sharing the gospel with those that will come and hear. And one of the people that comes to hear him, probably in an effort to shut him down, is Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. And he's converted along with his whole family. And Paul personally baptizes them. And that should be great news, right? That in spite of everything that happened in the synagogue, that Paul has had an effective visit, the kingdom has grown, the church has expanded, the word's gone out. Paul must be feeling pretty good. But that's not what we find here. That's not the context that leads us to believe. Both from this passage and Paul's later writings to the Corinthians, we can piece together that Paul's pretty down here. He might not be in the best of places. That's very likely that the conversion of this synagogue ruler only intensified. We know it did. It intensified greatly Jewish opposition. But remember, though, Paul had even said from the beginning, before he got there and was oppressed, he entered the city, he'll say later, in weakness and great fear and trembling. And that's intensified now. The opposition is intense. The constant antagonizing from the Jews and the fierce opposition to his ministry is surely weighing on Paul, and he's definitely considering moving on. But not only is the opposition intense, so is the immorality. As one commentator speculated, there had been culture shock in Athens, and now Paul experienced moral shock in Corinth. Its sweat and perfume and grit smothered Paul's righteous soul, and he became depressed. Again, the life lived on mission can be a hard one. When I first started attending City of God, 12, maybe pushing 13 years ago now, I would hear Eric from the stage every week exhorting us, we need to live on mission. We have to be on mission. We need to live on mission. And I had never heard that phrase before in my life. And I'll be honest, I nodded along, but I thought the whole time he was saying omniscient. And I'm like, man, I don't know if I have that in me. Which I know. I still have days where I think, man, I don't know if I have it in me. And that's not because I don't love Jesus, because I do. And it's not because I don't love others, because I do. And it's not because I don't love the gospel and want to see it spread to the uttermost parts of the earth, because I do. But if I'm being honest, if I can be transparent, there are days where, man, it seems like it's all I can do just to kill my own sin, to protect my own marriage, to disciple my own kids, to shepherd my own flock, just to, in general, to endure the grind of a life lived constantly going against the cultural grain. That sometimes the wickedness and the wear and the worries of the world leave me quite weak and weary, to the point where it's hard to even consider those outside my bubble. I'll confess to you the same thing I've on many occasions had to confess to God. Many days I've had to confess to God that my heart, Lord, today, my heart is willing to be a martyr for you, but not a missionary. And I think when it comes to mission, many of us find ourselves there often. And I think that's where we find Paul here, that even amongst all the good that's happening, the weight of the world is so much that it's hard to continue to press into mission. In this moment of discouragement and despair, hope bursts through. And it's the same hope that you and I have in these seasons as well. And it's the promise found in verse 10 where the Lord says simply, I am with you. I'm with you. It's the same promise he made to Abraham when Abraham began to question whether or not God could fulfill his promises to him as he said he would. It's the same promise, I am with you, that he gave to Moses when Moses felt so inadequate for the task at hand. He says, Paul, I am with you. Notice what's happening in verse 11, because it's very significant. We've already seen it a few times in the book of Acts. We've seen it in Acts 5 with the imprisoned apostles. We've seen it in Acts 9 with Paul and Ananias, and we've seen it in Acts 16 with the Macedonian call. Over and over again, we see God commissioning people for ministry. And in Acts, it's happening again here. The commissioning, this gospel call to task, is practiced repeatedly and sometimes broadly to all disciples and sometimes specifically to a certain individual in a certain place and time. Here in 9 through 11, it follows the same pattern as so many of the commissions before it. First, there's a confrontation, the appearance of a divine commissioner. Other times in other passages, we've seen it be an angel or some other messenger, but here we get it's the Lord Jesus who calls out to Paul in a familiar voice. And they have that confrontation. There's a commissioner that appears. And secondly, there's a call to undertake a God-given task or duty. And this is the key, with the assurance of divine enabling, the promise that God will empower and equip them for this job. So here's the commissioning. Paul is being recommissioned for gospel ministry here with the promise. God says, here's what I want you to do, and here's how it'll be done through me, by me, and for me. Again, we've seen this commission given to individuals here in Acts, but in many of the Gospels, Jesus gave this to the whole church, right? Consider Matthew, the end of Matthew in the Great Commission statement. Christ says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. There's the commission, right? There's the task, and then here's the promise. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. The commission is to go and spread the gospel, and that commission is rooted in the promise of the presence and the power of God. Paul is recommissioned here and reminded of this truth. If I am with you, nothing can stand against you. And this is good news for us, church. This is good news for the weary. This is good news for the scared. This is good news for the timid. This is good news for the introverted. This is good news for the discouraged. You are not alone. Many of you are probably familiar with the story of the life of Adoniram Judson, who's considered by many to be the father of American missions, as he was the first or one of the first missionaries sent out from America. When he and his wife of only 2 weeks, and when the Judsons finally reached their destination of Burma in July of 1813, they entered a land that had been described as impermeable for Christians. Of the few previous missionaries who tried to venture into this land, none lasted long. Either they died or they left quickly. The Judsons had to spend the first 3 years there just learning the language, and it wasn't until year 4 that they tried to host their first public worship service, and it wasn't until year 6 that they baptized their first convert. By year 12, they'd seen 18 Burmese people trust Christ, but around that time, Judson was imprisoned when a war broke out, and there was concerns he might actually be a British spy. During these 17 months of prison, Judson faced much physical suffering and hardship, while Anne bravely fought for his release, as well as her own survival as the lone Western woman in an anti-Christian nation that was actively at war. Judson toiled for God many years in Burma, but they were hard years acquainted with much grief. Aside from the opposition to his message, the ostracism of not knowing the people or the language, the imprisonment and torture, on top of all that, between 1812 and 1850, 24 of Judson's relatives or close associates died, including several of his children, his first and second wives, which he had to bury in Burma. All the while, Judson toiled away, going as long sometime as 18 years without a furlough. Judson continued to press in the mission under this simple but lasting motto, devoted for life. The end of one of Judson's letters home captures the reason why Judson was able to continue to press into mission work despite all the hardship. He writes, "But should I go thither, it is the most painful reflection that I must go alone, and also uncertain." Judson said his desire was to stay in Burma until the cross of Christ was planted there forever. And today there are several million Christians in the land where he toiled, and every one of them can trace their spiritual heritage back to this one man. This is just one of countless examples of men and women who were obedient to the Great Commission given by God and had to throw themselves wholly on the promise that God would never leave them nor forsake them. Why does this truth push us towards mission, though? Why does it push us along when we want to throw in the towel? I like the way Pastor Isaac Adams, in his little book on battling discouragement and evangelism, puts it specifically in regards to this Acts 18 text. He says, God's reassurance of his presence and sovereignty put steel in Paul's spine. His faith in God's sovereignty produced evangelistic endurance. And Paul did endure. He stayed another 18 months and had an extremely fruitful in ministry. And just as it did for Paul, God's power and his presence should encourage us. God's power, his absolute sovereignty in all things, should towards mission and not away from it. It's probably another sermon for another week and deserves much more time, but there is a temptation sometimes to take the truth that God is sovereign and in control of all things, and the promise that he will surely and effectively draw all those who are his to himself, regardless of my efforts, and use as an excuse not anything that we have said about the nature and duty of evangelism. It does not affect the necessity of evangelism. It does not affect the urgency of evangelism. It does not affect the starts Monday mentality. I don't know if you guys have ever veggies only. I'm going to do the Daniel diet. All right, so what do you do? What do you do over the weekend, right? You spend Saturday and Sunday consuming enough food that would last a family of 4 until Wednesday. You start your diet Monday and you're living off your feast from the weekend, and then come Thursday when you finally get hungry, you begin to think, I don't think this is for me. This doesn't suit my lifestyle. Well, here's the thing, and I want to be clear. I love thinking about outreach strategies, and I like evangelistic events, and I love missions conferences. I love classes that teach you how to share your faith, and I love books on how to steer apologetics and thinking through how we can navigate other ideas and ideologies in our world to try and push their adherence towards Christ. But here's the thing. For most of us to be faithful in the context in which God has called us to, a lot of those things are not going to be prerequisites for us to. We're trying to think through, how can I be consistent and sustainable in my trying to live on mission? For most of us, mission is going to happen in the overflow. Mission happens in the overflow of ordinary faithfulness. And here's what I mean by that. For the Christian, when done correctly, everything from prayer to serving to ministry to giving all flows out of a personal connection and intimate relationship with Jesus Christ. That when we are regularly communing with God in prayer, meditating on his for the good of the body, then as a result of that, the overflow will be a gospel residue left with every person we encounter. So again, going back, maybe God will call some of you to be Paul in Athens, to master apologetics and a defense of the faith, and you'll spend your time reasoning with others at great length against religions and philosophies of the world, and if God puts you there, God bless you, we need you, our prayers are with you, and I pray there's so much fruit from that. But for the majority of us, I think it's far more likely that we won't be called to be Paul in the Areopagus, but we'll be called to be Aquila and Priscilla in the city, in the marketplace, and in our homes. And in doing so, we will draw souls to the good news of the gospel with things like radical hospitality, brotherly affection, consideration of the poor and overlooked, cheerful generosity, unique joy, lasting hope, constant prayer, missional marriages, and just an overall pattern of life that counters the ways of this world and presses into the abundant life of self-denial found in Jesus Christ. And from this ordinary faithfulness will flow gospel conversations and mission. Context of evangelism. That is, we must not just wait for witnessing opportunities to happen. Okay, so we have this concept that evangelism happens in the overflow of ordinary faithfulness. Now, this concept, this idea, though, it highlights two problem areas for many of us, that if effective mission isn't happening in our lives, it's likely one of these two causes. We're either empty or we're isolated. In scenario A, we're empty. There's no overflow of gospel mission in our life because we personally don't have anything to give. If we're in a season where we aren't actively engaging in prayer or in the word or we're not in community, then our well is empty, right? There's not an intimate relationship with Jesus, and we're not going to give anyone else something we don't have ourselves. But in scenario B, the opposite might be true but have the same effect. We might have all those things, regular time in prayer, deep times of studying God's word, active participation in church, and yet be completely shut off from anyone who doesn't look, think, act, or believe like us. And we might be at full well without a parched person in sight. For effective and sustainable mission, to have that mission overflow from faithful living to occur, we need to be both active in the content and the context of the gospel. What that means is that for some of us, we need to learn how to commune with God in a better and deeper way. And for others of us, we need to learn how to commune with other people in a better and deeper way. The band can come up and we're going to close. As I've wrestled with this text, and it's been a very convicting sermon to put together personally, I always wrestle with how do I pray for the church? How do I pray for them to take this passage and apply it? And as I've thought through that, I've had almost a humorous, laughable prayer for the church, but I hope you'll hear me out on it. This week I've been praying that God would make us a sticky church. A sticky church. I know that makes no sense, but hear me out. All right, I've got four kids. That's one more than the last time I had when I preached up here, but you know how it is. The hospital calls. It's been 3 years. You're eligible for an upgrade. We added a line. It's been great. And as a parent, you kind of pick your battles. As a father, you pick your battles. And part of choosing your battles is just accepting there are some you're not going to win. And as a dad, one of the things that I've kind of resolved to is that for the next, probably 10 years or so, I'm never going to have a clean shirt again. It's just not going to happen. And I'll admit, straightforward, I wasn't doing so great before kids. But ever since 8 years ago, when we had children, there's not a day that goes by without a spot or a stain or something showing up mysteriously on my shirt. Between the 2-month-old and the drool and the spit up, and a 3-year-old who has this stash of lollipops and suckers we can't find, and the 6-year-old who's constantly into the makeup and the glitter, and the 8-year-old who constantly has like the hot Cheeto Taki fingers. Between all the wrestling and the playing and the hugs and the snuggles, I'm just convinced it's never going to happen for me. I'm always going to have stains on my shirt. And I'm not even embarrassed about it anymore because they're my kids and I love them, but they leave a trail. Today's the first day I've been able to breathe out of my nose this week because my kids are so great at sharing. If I could share the gospel as well as my kids share germs, I wouldn't need to preach this message to us this morning. But that's the reality. They're my kids, and I love them, and they leave a trail. And I love this church, and I hope we leave a trail too. That wherever we go and whatever we do and whoever we encounter, there's left behind us an overflow of gospel residue. Gospel residue is my phrasing, but Paul calls it the aroma of Christ. 2 Corinthians, he says, "But thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumphal procession, and through us." Let's pray.